Welcome to this study of the 78th question of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia, where we talk about malice as a cause of sin. And as we are now deep into the Summa, I want you to begin to see certain themes or things that kind of hold everything together, principles that St. Thomas Aquinas uses when teaching in the Summa. And one of them should be the word malice. And as soon as you see that, it should probably raise flags, because St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't like to talk about malice because malice is, I guess, equatable with evil, and he would and does argue in the Summa that evil doesn't really have being in and of itself. Evil is just an absence of the good. So when we talk about malice as a cause of sin, we have to keep that in mind, that really there isn't really malice per se. There's a lack of good. There's a lack of order. There's a lack of rectitude, I guess you could say, in the moral life. And this is what's going to cause sin, is just kind of, rather than evil itself, but the pulling back of the good that should be in place with regard to moral decisions. And that's what's going to be the cause of sin and malice. And also another thing is that you're going to see him talking a lot about individual actions versus habitual actions, or things that are derived from habit, which is almost like something we don't have to think about because it's become so much habituated in our life. And he's going to definitely ask a couple of questions here related to habit and habitual actions when it comes to sin. So there's 4 articles in this question, so not too long. And the first one says whether anyone sins through certain malice. And again, you're going to see again the emphasis here on really a pulling back from the good rather than directly malicious acts in and of themselves. And he says here, beginning in this corpus of this question, he says, man, like any other being, has naturally an aptitude for the good. Interesting that he says like any other being, because you'd have to include in that, the irrational animals that are always seeking the good. If a dog attacks somebody, or if a bee stings you, they're not acting maliciously. they're actually seeking some kind of good, some kind of protection, something is good in the order of the big picture. And so I think when you get that into your head, it really changes the way you see the world. It changes the way you see bee stings or ant bites or something like that. Mosquitoes, one of the big ones as well. And so if his appetite incline away to evil, speaking about the human person, this is due to corruption or disorder in some one of the principles of man, for it is thus that sin occurs in the actions of natural things. Now, the principles of human acts are the intellect and the appetite, both rational, that is the will, and the sensitive. Okay, there's another important point. When it comes to sin, or human acts in general, we're looking at 3 things. We're looking at the intellect or the reason, we're looking at the will, which is the intellectual appetite, and then we're looking at the sensitive appetite, the passions, the things that we desire on a sensitive level. Those are really the 3 things that are going to play into human actions, and they also all play, in concert with one another, and that relationship between those 3 is very, very important. Okay, so therefore, even as sin occurs in human acts, sometimes through a defect of the intellect, as when anyone sins through ignorance, and sometimes through a defect of the sensitive appetite, as when anyone sins through passion, so too does it occur through a defect consisting in the disorder of the will. Okay, again, the will is what ultimately kind of decides. The intellect informs the will, and then the will, being the intellectual desire, is going to make the final call. It's going to move the other aspects, the other faculties of the human person in determining whether an action is good or bad. Now, the will is out of order when it loves more the lesser good. Okay, very important concept here. Again, the consequence of loving a thing less is that one chooses to suffer some hurt in its regard in order to obtain a good that one loves more, as when a man, even knowingly, suffers the loss of a limb that he may save his life, which he loves more. Okay, great example here. So we might take another example. We might take some really nasty medicine in order to feel better. So we're sacrificing the good in order for a greater good. So what he's going to make a point here is that when we choose a lesser good in order to satisfy some sensitive appetite or to feel good in the moment, we're sacrificing a greater good. And that's going to be the basis of all sin. Okay, accordingly, when an inordinate will loves some temporal good, that is, riches or pleasure, more than the order of reason or divine law or divine charity, or some such thing, it follows that it is willing to suffer the loss of some spiritual good so that it may obtain possession of some temporal good. Okay, that's the definition of sin. When we choose a temporal good, we choose a lesser good, and willingly forfeit the spiritual good, forfeit the alignment with the good according to reason or divine order. That's what we do when we sin, right? Now, evil is merely the privation of some good, as I mentioned before, and so a man wishes knowingly a spiritual evil, which is evil simply, whereby he is deprived of a spiritual good in order to possess a temporal good. Wherefore he is said to sin through a certain malice or on purpose, because he chooses evil knowingly. Okay, so again, Thomas hates to admit that because he doesn't want to admit that he doesn't believe that we're seeking the evil directly, but by choosing a lesser good, in essence, that is what we are doing. Article 2, whether everyone that sins through habit sins through certain malice. Okay, now he's getting into habitual actions, things that have become habitual through repetition, or we just keep doing something bad and it just almost becomes second nature to us. And he's saying, is this malicious? He says there is a difference between a sin committed by one who has the habit and a sin committed by habit. For it is not necessary to use a habit, since it is subject to the will of the person who has the habit. Since habit is defined as being something we use when we will, and thus, even as it may happen that one who has a vicious habit may break forth into a virtuous act, because a bad habit does not corrupt reason altogether, something of which remains unimpaired, the result being that a sinner does some works which are generically good. Okay, I love this teaching because we may have a habit of, let's say, overeating, but that doesn't mean we may not occasionally eat well because we've broken away. Reason has come back to dictate what we should do, even though we have that habitual aspect to us that always seems to bring us down the wrong road. But that doesn't mean that every single action that we do may be according to that bad habit that we've developed, right? So too it may happen sometimes that one who has a vicious habit acts not from that habit, but through the uprising of a passion, or again through ignorance. So even though we have a bad habit, we may act even wrongly, not according to the habit, but according to a passion, or according to just kind of a one-off action. But whenever he uses the vicious habit, he must needs sin through certain malice, because to anyone that has a habit, whatever is befitting to him in respect of that habit has the aspect of something lovable, since it thereby becomes, in a way, co-natural to him, right? We don't even think about it. We just act according to that habit, whether it be a good habit, a virtue, or a bad habit, a vice. According as custom and habit are as second nature. Now, the very thing which befits a man in respect of a vicious habit is something that excludes a spiritual good, the result being that a man chooses a spiritual evil. Okay, that's, as we mentioned before in the last article, and that he may obtain possession of what befits him in respect of that habit, and this is to sin through certain malice. Wherefore it is evident that whoever sins through habit sins through certain malice. So the malice is that we've gotten ourselves into a habit of just co-naturally choosing the bad, right? It's become so co-natural to us that we don't even think about it. We're in a habit of oversleeping or overeating or sexual sins or pornography or what have you. But he's saying, yeah, ultimately that is malicious. Article 3, whether one who sins through certain malice sins through habit. Okay, so now he's kind of reversing it. He's saying, if we sin through malice, do we sin through habit? And he says the will is related differently to good and to evil because from the very nature of the power, it is inclined to the rational good as its proper object, wherefore every sin is said to be contrary to nature. Okay, there's Thomas's optimism there, in that we are naturally good. We are inclined to the good. Our will always seeks the good, even if sometimes it is the lesser good. Hence, if a will be inclined by its choice to some evil, this must be occasioned by something else. Sometimes, in fact, this is occasioned through some defect in the reason, as when anyone sins through ignorance, and sometimes this arises through the impulse of the sensitive appetite, as when anyone sins through passion. Again, so you see he's talking about reason, he's talking about passion, he's talking about the will, these three aspects that come into play when we talk about the good or bad of human actions. Yet neither of these amounts to a sin through certain malice, for then alone does anyone sin through certain malice when his will is moved to evil of its own accord. This may happen in two ways. First, through his having a corrupt disposition inclining him to evil, okay? Because again, we're naturally inclined to the good. So if we're inclined to the evil, that's not natural. That's malice. That's evil. So that in respect of that disposition, some evil is, as it were, suitable and similar to him, and to this thing, by reason of its suitableness, the will tends as to something good, because everything tends to its own accord to that which is suitable to it. So you can see the disorder here. We're made to be inclined to the good, but when that's not the case, something has gone awry. Moreover, this corrupt disposition is either a habit acquired by custom or a sickly condition on the part of the body, as is the case of a man who is naturally inclined to certain sins by reason of some natural corruption in himself. Secondly, the will, of its own accord, may tend to an evil through the removal of some obstacle. For instance, if a man be prevented from sinning, not through sin being in itself displeasing to him, but through hope of eternal life or fear of hell, if hope give place to despair or fear to presumption, he will end up sinning through certain malice, being freed from the bridle, as it were. Okay, it is evident, therefore, that sin committed through certain malice always presupposes some inordinateness in man, which, however, is not always a habit. So that it does not follow of necessity, if a man sin through certain malice, that he sins through habit. So yeah, just because we're inclined on a one-off occasion to something that's inordinate, something that is really not in accord with our nature, it doesn't necessarily mean that we yet have established a habit. Article 4, whether it is more grievous to sin through certain malice than through passion. Okay, so there's a picture here of a very passionate kid, and Thomas is going to say, a sin committed through malice is more grievous than a sin committed through passion, for three reasons. Okay, first, because a sin consists chiefly in the act of the will, it follows that, other things being equal, a sin is all the more grievous according as the movement of the sin belongs more to the will. Now, when a sin is committed through malice, the movement of sin belongs more to the will, which is then moved to evil on its own accord than when a sin is committed through passion, when the will is impelled to sin by something extrinsic, as it were. So the passion, remember when we learned about the passions, the word passion comes from passive. It's something that kind of happens to us. We react to an external influence. You know, somebody hits us and we get angry, so that's a passion, which is a response to something external. Whereas the will is inside us. The will is a higher part of the soul. It's the intellectual appetite. It's the, so again, this is going to be more malicious if we sin through the will than through a passion. And, let's see. Okay, secondly, because the passion which incites the will to sin soon passes away, so that man repents of his sin and soon returns to his good intentions, whereas the habit through which a man sins is a permanent quality, so that he who sins through malice abides longer in his sin. For this reason, Aristotle compares the intemperate man who sins through malice to a sick man who suffers from a chronic disease, while he compares the incontinent man who sins through passion to one who suffers intermittently. Okay, finally, number 3, because he who sins through certain malice is ill-disposed in respect to the end itself. Okay, this is the telos, the end. We're directed to God. Okay, and anything that takes us away from this is going to be evil and inordinate, right? Which is a principle in matters of action. And so the effect is more dangerous than in case of the man who sins through passion, whose purpose tends to a good end, although this purpose is interrupted on account of the passion for the time being. Now the worst of all defects is defect of principle. Therefore it is evident that a sin committed through malice is more grievous than one committed through passion. So all of a sudden you're overcome by a passion to overeat or to commit some kind of sexual sin. Well, that came upon you quickly, whereas the habit or the malice is something that's more ingrained in us. It's something that's part of us. It's more of a principle rather than just kind of a spontaneous action. And that's not to excuse people from sinning through passion, but Thomas is making the point that habitual malicious sin is worse compared to something that is sinful through a passion. All right, thank you for joining me. This is question 78 as we continue on this treatise of evil habits, vices, and sins here in the Summa Theologia. God bless you.